I was 17 years old the night my own father folded my life into a cardboard suitcase and handed me to strangers. Not because I was cruel or broken, but because I was inconvenient. And if this story reaches you, hold on, because it doesn't begin with violence or screaming. It begins with silence, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there forever. My name is Alawan May Hartley. I am 78 now, my hair thin and silver, my hands shaking as I rock slowly on a porch that creaks louder than my voice. And people think old age brings peace, but what it really brings is memory, memory sharp enough to cut, memory that wakes you at night gasping for air, and every evening when the sun dips low and the fireflies rise. I am no longer an old woman. I am 17 again, barefoot on a wooden floor, listening to my father clear his throat because he can't look at me when he decides my fate. My mama died when I was 15. Pneumonia took her slowly, cruelly, leaving behind half-folded laundry and a house that smelled like her soap for months afterward. And after she was gone, the warmth drained out of our home like water from a cracked bucket. Daddy became quiet, smaller somehow, and then came Betrayal, my stepmother, a woman with polished nails, pressed dresses, and eyes that measured love in usefulness. And from the moment she crossed our threshold, I felt myself shrinking, folding inward, becoming something she tolerated but never wanted. And she never hit me or shouted. She didn't have to, because her words were sharp enough. She's almost grown. She eats like a farmhand. Girls learn responsibility when they're useful. And Daddy nodded because disagreement would have required courage he no longer possessed. 2 months after her wedding ring slid onto his finger, he told me I was leaving. Not for school or opportunity, but for service. He said it was good honest work, said I'd have a roof over my head and money sent home. And when he spoke the name Rothwell Estate, my stomach sank, because everyone in town knew Caldrick Rothwell. The kind of man people praised publicly and warned about privately. A man whose handshake could open doors and whose anger could close mouths. And Daddy spoke like it was already done, like my consent was unnecessary. And when I asked if I could stay, just until winter, his eyes stayed glued to the floor. And that was the moment I knew I had already been sold. The drive there felt endless, fields rolling past like they were watching me be erased, the radio playing something cheerful that felt like mockery. And when we pulled into that long gravel drive, dust rising around the tires, Daddy didn't even turn off the engine fully. He handed me my suitcase, pressed $5 into my palm, and said, "Mind your manners, don't shame us," before driving away, leaving me standing alone with my entire life balanced in one shaking hand. The house was large but cold, white walls, dark windows, and a porch that felt like it was waiting to swallow me. And the first person I met was Marwan Slate, a tall woman with tired eyes and hair pulled tight, who looked at me once and said, "Rules keep you alive here," before leading me to a narrow room where another girl sat folding clothes. Iris Bell, her fingers quick, hers wary, and when the door closed, she leaned close and whispered, "Never be alone with him." And when I asked why, she turned her face to the wall and said nothing. Days blurred into chores and exhaustion, scrubbing floors until my knees burned, washing sheets that smelled of other people's lives, learning which floorboards creaked and which doors must never be opened. And then, one night, when the house had gone quiet and the lamps burned low, I heard his boots, slow and heavy, stopping in the kitchen doorway behind me. And without raising his voice, Caldrick Rothwell said, "When you're finished, come to the study." And my hands froze in the dishwater, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might split my ribs, because every warning Iris had given me came crashing back all at once. And when he walked away without waiting for an answer, I knew refusal wasn't an option, because refusal requires safety, and I had none. I finished those dishes slower than I ever had in my life, each clink of porcelain sounding like a countdown. And when I finally climbed those stairs, my legs felt borrowed, my hands shaking so badly I had to press them together just to knock. And when I entered, the room smelled of paper and ink and something heavy. And instead of touching me, instead of shouting or smiling, he slid a paper across the desk and said, "Read." And when I did, voice trembling, reading words about land deeds and contracts I barely understood. His eyes followed my mouth like he was memorizing every syllable, and when I finished, he took the paper back, nodded once, and said, "Tomorrow night again," dismissing me like nothing unusual had happened, leaving me confused, shaken, and strangely relieved, because relief after fear doesn't feel like safety, it feels like obligation. That night, lying awake in that narrow bed, listening to Iris breathe softly beside me, I realized something far more dangerous than fear had entered my life. I was now holding a secret, and secrets have weight. Secrets bend backs. Secrets chain you quietly until you don't remember what freedom felt like. And I didn't yet know that this secret would ask more of me than my youth, more than my trust, more than my heart. But I would learn, slowly and painfully, that some men don't break you with force, they break you by needing you. And once they do, your life is never truly your own again. Asterisk, I thought reading papers was all he wanted from Emmy. Asterisk, I didn't yet know he was about to ask me for something that would bind us together in ways neither of us could escape. They say fear announces itself loudly, but the most dangerous fear arrives quietly, settles beside you, and pretends to be routine. And if you're still listening, don't blink now, because this is where my childhood truly ended. Every night after that first one, I scrubbed dishes with my stomach knotted so tight I could barely breathe, waiting for the sound of Caldrick Rothwell's boots, waiting for the words that summoned me like property. And some nights he said nothing, passing through the kitchen like I didn't exist. And those nights were somehow worse because the waiting stretched my nerves thinner than wire. But on other nights he'd pause, not looking at me, and say, "After you finish," and I'd feel that same cold spread through my chest as I dried my hands and followed him upstairs like a ghost following its own funeral. And always it was the study. Always the same ritual. Papers slid across the desk. His finger tapping where he wanted me to begin. My voice shaking at first, then steadying as words filled the room. And never once did he touch me. Never once did he raise his voice. And that restraint confused me more than cruelty ever could have. Because I had prepared myself for pain, not dependence. I began to notice things I hadn't at first. How his jaw tightened when I stumbled over a sentence. How his eyes closed as I read. How he repeated phrases under his breath afterward like he was trying to trap them in his mind. And one night, after I finished reading a letter from the county office, he asked a question that changed everything. "Read it again," and when I did, slow this time, he leaned forward like a student, not a master. And that was when the truth slipped out of him like blood from a wound he'd hidden too long. "I can't read," he said, finally, staring at the wall instead of me. His voice low and stripped of authority. Not properly, and I remember sitting there stunned, the world tilting slightly. Because this man who owned land, who controlled wages, who commanded respect from everyone in town, was illiterate. And in that moment, I understood why I'd been chosen, not because I was obedient or quiet, but because I was useful in a way that terrified him. He told me then, piece by piece, how he'd memorized shapes of words instead of understanding them. How teachers beat his knuckles when he was a boy. How his father pulled him out of school before anyone could label him slow. How his late wife used to read contracts to him in the evenings, and how when she died, the world became a maze of ink and paper he could no longer navigate alone. And as he spoke, the power in the room shifted. Because suddenly I was holding something that could destroy him. And he knew it, and he made sure I knew it too, telling me no one must ever find out, that people only respect what they believe is strong. And weakness, especially in a man like him, was unforgivable. That night he didn't dismiss me quickly. Instead he asked, almost reluctantly, if I could help him learn, and when I hesitated, he reminded me where I came from. Reminded me I had nowhere else to go, and so the lessons began. Quietly, secretly, after everyone slept. Me teaching a grown man his letters like a child, drawing them slowly on scrap paper, guiding his hand, repeating sounds until his frustration shook the table. And some nights he slammed his fist down so hard I flinched, not because he meant to scare me, but because shame is louder than anger when it's been buried for decades. Weeks pass like this, summer pressing heavy against the windows, my world shrinking to chores by day and lessons by night, and the other girls noticed. Of course they did, the whispers, the sideways looks. Iris barely speaking to me anymore, and when gossip crept too close, Caldrick moved me to a small cabin near the orchard. Said it was for privacy, said people talk too much. And standing there alone that first night, the walls thin, the silence thick, I realized how easily isolation can be disguised as privilege. In that cabin, the lessons deepened, his reading improved slowly, painfully, and with each small victory, something else grew between us. Not romance at first, but reliance, and reliance is a dangerous thing when power is uneven. Because he began to confide in me, telling me fears he'd never spoken aloud. About losing his land, his standing. About being exposed as a fraud, and I listened. Because listening was safer than speaking. And because part of me, the abandoned girl my father left behind, felt needed for the first time in her life. I told myself I was only doing my duty, that gratitude and affection were not the same. But when his hand brushed mine as I corrected his writing, when his voice softened when he said my name, I knew I was lying to myself. Because hearts don't ask permission before attaching themselves to survival. The first time he kissed me, it wasn't planned. It wasn't violent. It was hesitant, like he was afraid of crossing a line he couldn't uncross. And when it happened, something inside me broke and bloomed at the same time. Because affection from a man like him felt like protection. And protection feels like love when you've never had either. The morning after, he pulled away. Ashamed, distant, retreating back into formality, reminding me of my place without raising his voice. And I felt the weight of my mistake settle in my chest. Because I had confused being needed with being chosen. And those are not the same thing. The days grew colder, his temper shorter, a lawsuit brewing with a neighbouring family over land and water rights. Papers piling up faster than his reading skills. And the fear I heard in his voice those nights was no longer just about letters, it was about exposure. About standing in court unable to read the words that could strip him of everything. And when he drank, he talked too much. When he was sober, he closed himself off completely. And I stood between those two versions of him, neither fully safe. I began saving small amounts of my wages. Hiding coins in the hem of my dress, dreaming quietly of escape. Because love that feels like obligation eventually feels like a cage. And cages don't always have bars, sometimes they're built from gratitude and fear and silence. And the night the barn burned on the neighbouring farm, accusations flying, guns drawn, hatred decades old boiling over. I ran into the firelit chaos to stop him from destroying himself. And when the truth came out that the fire was an accident, I thought maybe this was the moment things would change, that the feud would end, that he would finally let go of the anger and secrecy that ruled his life. But change is terrifying to men who survive on control, and when dawn broke over ashes and regret, he looked at me with something like love and something like surrender. And I knew the hardest part was still ahead. I believed stopping him from violence would save us both. I didn't yet know the real battle was about to turn against me. Asterisk. Love doesn't always leave with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it leaves by pretending nothing ever happened. And if you've ever been erased while still standing in the same room, then you'll understand what came next. After the fire, after the accusations burned out with the barn, I believe something sacred had shifted between Caldrick Rothwell and me. Because when a man stands on the edge of ruin and steps back because of your voice, you assume you matter more than silence. But the very next morning, the air between us changed. Colder, formal, careful, like he was rebuilding walls brick by brick, while pretending they'd always been there. And I was left standing inside wondering when I'd been pushed out. I'm Alawan May Hartley, and even now at 78. I still remember the sound of his boots that morning, heavy but controlled. Not the hesitant steps of the man who'd held my face in the lamplight, but the measured stride of the master of the house reclaiming his authority. And when he spoke to me, it was with distance, calling me Miss Hartley again, as if the weeks of whispered lessons and shared secrets had been nothing more than a fever dream. The lawsuit grew uglier, papers arriving thicker and crueler. Legal language twisted like barbed wire, and I read until my throat burned, until my eyes ached, until I began recognizing words before he did, correcting him softly, and each time I helped him avoid exposure. I felt myself disappearing further, because my value to him was shrinking back into usefulness alone. One night, as frost crept into the orchard and my cabin grew colder than loneliness itself, he told me it had been a mistake, that what happened between us couldn't continue, that people talked, that respect mattered, that my future shouldn't be ruined by his weakness. And I stood there listening, nodding like a good girl, while inside something shattered quietly. Because he spoke of my protection while protecting only himself. I didn't cry in front of him. Girls like me learn early that tears make men uncomfortable and indifference keeps them powerful. But when I returned to my cabin that night, I sat on the edge of the bed and finally understood something my mama never had the chance to teach me. That love offered by someone who holds her survival is never freely given. The days that followed fell hollow, the lessons moved back into the main house. Watched eyes everywhere, iris barely meeting my gaze. Whispers sharp enough to cut skin. And Marwan Slate watching me with a look that said she knew more than she spoke. And maybe she did. Because women like her always recognize another woman surviving something unnamed. I began planning my escape quietly, saving coins. Folding hope into the seams of my dress. Writing a letter to my mother's cousin in a city far enough away to forget. Because staying meant watching myself shrink into a role that demanded silence and gratitude in equal measure. Then came the day the lawyer returned. City shoes on country floors, briefcase heavy with threats. And I sat nearby reading while Caldrick nodded like he understood everything being said. Sweat collecting at his temples, his fingers tapping in patterns I recognized as panic. And when the lawyer left, slamming the door of his car like punctuation, Caldrick collapsed into a chair and said, "I can't do this, not as a command, but as a confession." And for a moment, just a moment, the man I cared for resurfaced. Scared, exhausted, unraveling, and I went to him. Not as a servant, but as a woman who had already lost too much. I told him we could prepare, that we'd read everything together, that he wasn't alone unless he chose to be. And he looked at me like someone staring at a life boat they're too proud to climb into. And that's when I understood pride was his truest master. He refused my help publicly, but came to my cabin secretly again. Desperation erasing principles, and those nights were the hardest. Because intimacy returned without acknowledgement, tenderness without promise, love without safety. And each morning he pulled away again, leaving me to hold the weight of what we pretended didn't exist. The final break came quietly, without drama. The way real endings often do, when he informed me he'd arranged for another girl to take over household duties soon. Younger, less educated, easier to control, and that I should prepare to leave once the trial concluded, as if dismissing me were an act of mercy. I nodded, thanked him even, because humiliation teaches politeness faster than kindness ever could. And that night, I packed my suitcase again, the same cardboard one my father handed me years before. Realizing some girls are given away more than once, first by family, then by love, and sometimes by themselves for staying too long. I stood at the edge of the orchard before dawn, breath visible in the cold, listening to the land wake up without me. And when Caldric appeared, silent behind me, I didn't turn, because I knew if I saw his face, I might stay, and staying would have cost me what little of myself I had left. He didn't apologize. Men like him rarely do. Instead, he said my name softly, like it might anchor me. But names don't hold when dignity is already slipping through your fingers. And I walked away, each step heavier than the last, carrying not just heartbreak, but the knowledge that love without courage will always choose comfort over people. I thought leaving would end my pain. I didn't know the world was about to punish me for surviving. ****. Survival doesn't feel brave when you're doing it alone. It feels like running barefoot through broken glass and pretending your feet aren't bleeding. And if you're still listening to me now, stay. Because this is the part where I learned that escaping one cage doesn't mean the world won't try to build you another. When I left the Rothwell estate before sunrise, cardboard suitcase digging into my palm, coins sewn into my dress, hope folded thin enough to tear, I believe the hardest part was behind me. Because I had endured hunger, silence, and a love that erased me quietly. But nothing prepared me for how cruel freedom could be to a girl with no name and no protection. The road was long and unforgiving, towns blurring together, faces passing me by like I was already invisible. And by the time I reached the city, my shoes were split, my money nearly gone, and my confidence worn down to a trembling whisper. I found work, where women like me always do, in kitchens that smelled of grease and resignation, scrubbing plates while men looked at us like hunger itself. And every night I slept in rooms shared with strangers whose stories echoed my own indifferent accents. Women who had been promised safety and paid in scars. I kept my head down, like I always had, but the world noticed me anyway. Because it always does when you're young and alone. And it was there, in a boarding house run by a woman named Maylis Crow, sharp-tongued but observant, that my past finally caught up with me in the form of rumors. Someone had written to her, warning her about me, saying I was trouble, that I had been involved with a wealthy man, that I wasn't respectable, and respectability, I learned, is something men lose temporarily, but women lose forever. Maylis confronted me in the hallway one evening, letter shaking in her hand, and when I told her the truth, or at least as much of it as I could without breaking myself open, she listened quietly, then sighed and said, "Men survive their sins, women carry them," and I was gone by morning. From there, life unraveled quickly, job to job, bed to bed, hunger gnawing at me until it felt normal, and then one night, after a long shift and too many wandering eyes, my body betrayed me in a way I couldn't deny. Sickness in the mornings, dizziness that wouldn't pass, a fear growing in my chest heavier than any suitcase I'd ever carried. When the doctor finally said the word pregnant, it felt like the room tilted, because in that moment, every door slammed shut at once, unmarried, alone, marked by a past that followed me like a shadow. And carrying a child whose existence would condemn me in a world that forgave men easily and women never. I didn't cry in his office. I saved my tears for the walk back, where each step felt like a sentence being handed down. Because I knew exactly what people would say, what doors would close, how quickly sympathy turns into judgment when a woman's body tells a story she didn't get to narrate. I thought of Caldric, of the way he'd looked at me when he needed me, and how easily he'd let me go. And for the first time, anger burned hotter than heartbreak. Because his life continued untouched while mine collapsed under a truth he helped create. I considered everything then, things I'm not proud of. Endings that would have erased both me and the life growing inside me. But something stubborn, something my mama left behind in me, refused to disappear, and I chose to live, even if living meant suffering. I took the only option offered to girls like me at the time, a home for unwed mothers run by women who call kindness discipline and shame morality, where we scrubbed floors while carrying babies and were reminded daily of our sins. And I stayed silent because silence was survival. The labour was long and brutal, pain tearing through me until I screamed into a pillow so no one could hear. And when my daughter was finally placed in my arms, tiny and red and furious at the world, I felt a love so sharp it scared me, because loving her meant risking everything. They told me I should give her up, that it was best, that a girl like me couldn't provide, and for days I believed them. Because when the world repeats something long enough, it starts to sound like truth. But when I looked at her, really looked, I saw myself all over again, unwanted, inconvenient, already being decided for, and I knew I couldn't abandon her the way I'd been abandoned. I named her Uddenly because the name meant fire and clearing, destruction and beginning, and holding her, exhausted and terrified, I made a promise I didn't know how to keep, that she would never doubt she was chosen, even if it cost me everything. The course came quickly, work harder to find, rooms refusing me, doors closing the moment people saw my belly on my baby. And I learned how to smile while starving, how to lie convincingly, how to trade pride for diapers and sleep for safety. And some nights, rocking her in dark rooms, I wondered if leaving had truly been courage or just another way of suffering, because the world punishes women twice. Once for staying too long and again for daring to leave. I thought becoming a mother would finally save me. I didn't yet know the greatest betrayal of my life was still waiting. If you think motherhood always saves women, listen carefully, because sometimes it costs them everything instead. I am Alawan May Hartley, 78 years old now, and this is the part of my story I kept buried the longest, because even memory feels ashamed of it, but truth deserves air. And my truth is this: loving my daughter nearly destroyed me. Raising ardently alone in a world that punished women for surviving meant learning cruelty in quiet ways. Landlords who smiled until they saw a baby. Employers who praised my work until gossip reached them. Neighbors who offered help but took notes instead. And I learned to move often. Names changing slightly, lies becoming necessary. Because stability is a luxury denied to women without protection. I worked until my hands cracked, until my back bent early. Cleaning houses where women my age wore pearls and complained about loneliness, while I scrubbed their floors praying my child wouldn't wake up hungry again. And some nights I went without food, so Arden wouldn't know what hunger felt like. Telling her I'd already eaten, smiling while my stomach burned. Because mothers learn how to disappear for love. She grew bright and stubborn, eyes sharp, questions endless. And every time she asked about her father, my throat tightened. Because how do you explain abandonment without teaching bitterness? How do you tell a child the truth without handing her a wound? So I said he was gone, that he made choices he couldn't undo. And that was enough for a while. But the world is cruel to girls who grow into beauty without wealth. And by the time Arden was 17, the same age I'd been when my life fractured, I saw eyes follow her the way they once followed me, and fear became my shadow. I worked harder, pushed her towards school, toward dreams bigger than mine. Because I believe if she escaped poverty, she'd escape pain too. But life doesn't work like that. And the night she came home crying, heartbroken by her first betrayal, I realized no amount of sacrifice could shield her from becoming a woman in a world built to break them. When Arden left for the city, chasing opportunity, I packed her suitcase with shaking hands and a smile I practiced for hours, because mothers don't show fear. They swallow it, and when she hugged me goodbye, promising to visit, to call, to remember, I believed her. Because belief is easier than truth. Years passed quietly after that, my body aging faster than time, my hands arthritic, my back bent, and visits became calls, calls became holidays, holidays became excuses, and then excuses became silence, and one by one, pieces of my life were taken from me legally, signatures I didn't fully understand, property transferred for my own good, decisions made without me. Because age, like youth, makes you easy to dismiss. I watched my daughter succeed from a distance, photos sent occasionally, achievements framed in words that felt foreign, and I was proud, truly proud. But pride doesn't warm empty rooms at night, and love doesn't fill chairs at the table. When I could no longer live alone, they placed me here. This quiet home where memories echo louder than voices, where birthdays pass unnoticed and names fade from doors. And the cruelest part is that Arden didn't push me here out of hate, she did it out of convenience. Because life gets busy and old women become responsibilities instead of people. Sometimes she visits, well-dressed, distracted, kissing my forehead like she's apologizing without saying the words. And I forgive her every time, because forgiveness is the last thing a mother owns. I sit here now, rocking slowly, telling my story not because I want pity, but because I want truth remembered, that love without courage abandons quietly, that women survive what should have killed them, and that mothers give everything hoping their children will live freely, even if that freedom costs them memory, presence, and place. If my voice reaches you, remember this. Ask your mothers their stories before time steals their words. Because one day all that will remain of us is silence. And silence is the loneliest inheritance of all. If you're listening to me now, please don't let your mother become a memory while she's still alive. I don't know how much time I've left, but I know these stories like mine disappear quietly if they are not told. And women like me fade into rooms no one visits, carrying lifetimes in their chest that no one ever asks about. So if my voice reached you even for a moment, don't scroll past it like the world once scrolled past me. Remember that behind every wrinkled face is a girl who once dreamed, loved, waited, and survived things she never deserved. Call your mother, sit with your grandmother, listen before time steals their words, because one day all that will remain of us is a memory. And memories only live if someone chooses to keep them alive. Asterisk.